So welcome to week 7. This week we're going to be talking about some issues in scientific publishing. I'm also going to do a couple of demo edits for you on the first paper that you turned in, so that'll give me a chance to review and practice with you some of the skills that we learned in the first 4 weeks of this course. In this first module, I'm going to talk about the issue of plagiarism. So of course, all of you I'm sure are familiar with the concept of plagiarism. It's basically when you're trying to pass off some other person's writing, or also potentially some artwork or tables and figures, trying to pass it off as your own. And of course, everybody's aware that you shouldn't plagiarize, and I think most students have a pretty good concept of plagiarism at sort of a high level. Where sometimes it gets murky is in the particulars, when it comes down to exactly what constitutes plagiarism. Sometimes students are confused, so I want to try to bring some clarity to that in the lecture today and just give you some examples. But again, you're plagiarizing if you're trying to pass off somebody else's writing as your own. So if you're going to use somebody else's writing, of course you'll want to put it in quotation marks and properly cite it. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. And again, a lot of students kind of understand that if you copy, cut and paste a whole chunk of an article, that's plagiarism. But it can be more subtle than that. So cutting and pasting a sentence, or even a part of a sentence from another source and putting that into your own work as if you've written that's plagiarism. Taking somebody else's work and cutting and pasting it in, then slightly rewriting it or rearranging the words a little bit, that's plagiarism. So it's not okay to simply, rewrite something else a little bit and rearrange their words. You really need to start fresh and write your own words. So start from scratch. And of course, things like borrowing material from sites like Wikipedia, that's also not okay. So let me give you an example here. So I made this example up, but I took us a passage from Wikipedia and then I showed how a student might plagiarize it. So this was on Ernest Hemingway. It says, Ernest Miller Hemingway was an American author and journalist. His economical and understated style had a strong influence on 20th century fiction, while his life of adventure and his public image influenced later generations. So again, that's from Wikipedia. Now, this is a made-up example, but imagine a student then takes that work and says, okay, well, I'm going to just change it around a little bit and pass it off as my own work. So a plagiarized version would be Ernest Hemingway's thrifty and understated style. Notice that, again, I made this example up, but I went to the thesaurus and took economical and said, oh, well, the synonym for economical is thrifty, so I'll change that one thing. Ernest Hemingway's thrifty and understated style strongly influenced 20th century fiction. So I changed a few words there, but you can see it's still the original author's work. This is his or her words, not mine. And I've changed a few things, but that doesn't make it my work. And then I made another little change. I separated that second thought out into a second sentence. And then I put, instead of his life of adventure, I put his audacious lifestyle. So I rearranged it to his adventurous lifestyle, and then I went and found a synonym for adventurous. So I put his audacious lifestyle and public image also influenced later generations. So you can see I made a few little changes to that, but it's not my own work. It's not my own thoughts. I could have rewritten that without having any understanding of Hemingway, or what a thrifty and understated style means, or what his lifestyle really was. So that's plagiarism. So it's not okay to simply just kind of rearrange the words a little bit. That still constitutes plagiarism. Now you can imagine a student going to Wikipedia who has to write a report on Hemingway. If they only go to Wikipedia and try to write that report, they're not going to be able to do much better than plagiarism, right? In order to be able to write about Hemingway, I've got to go to enough sources so that I can figure out about his style and his lifestyle in order to be able to write about him. So I have to understand Hemingway enough in order to be able to generate new prose about him. And that's what you need to do to avoid plagiarism. So when you're writing about others' ideas or work, or you're writing from sources, you need to understand the material well enough. You need to go back and digest it so that you can put it in your own words. This means you're probably going to need to go to multiple sources, really understand what they're saying in order that you can put it completely in your own words. So you really want to start from scratch. You want to work from memory. So while it's okay to sort of cut and paste material into your roadmap or your outline as you're collecting material before you write in the pre-writing step, when you then go to write, you need to synthesize and digest all of that material and start afresh, work from memory, not just simply rearrange somebody else's words. You need to draw your own conclusions. You really have to understand the material yourself, draw your own conclusions. Why should you trust that the person who happened to write that in Wikipedia knows what they're talking about? If you're just plagiarizing their ideas, you're completely trusting that they completely understand Hemingway and have got it right. So you need to really go to multiple sources and make your own conclusions about Hemingway or whatever topic you're writing on. Again, you can't simply just mimic the original author's sentence structures or just rearrange the original author's words. That's still plagiarism. Another thing that students often are less aware of is that there's a concept called self-plagiarism. So recycling your own writing or data from one published paper to the next, that constitutes self-plagiarism, and that's also misconduct. That's also a no-no. So this would be things like, say you've published a paper, you copy a whole chunk of that paper and put it into a new paper, or you slightly rewrite the text from the old paper. The problem is that if you're just rehashing old material, why are you even publishing a new paper at all? If you have to rehash completely old material, that means you don't have anything new to say. So you cannot copy your previously published text. And of course, also there's the issue of that text is now copyrighted and owned by the journal, the published text, so it's not okay to use it again as well. So you actually cannot plagiarize from your own work. And there are some small exceptions to this in the sense of sometimes the experimental methods section of a paper. You may have done one experiment that yields many different data sets that you then write several papers about. And so some of the experimental methods from those papers may overlap. So if there's some repetitive material in the text of the experimental methods, it should not be a complete copy, or it should not be huge chunks of text that are copied. But if some of the materials and methods you explain in the same way in multiple papers, journal editors are usually fine with that. But you don't want to take whole sections out of your introduction section and just copy those. You actually need to start afresh and write new. Otherwise, again, why are you writing a new paper? Authors sometimes also engage in something that's not exactly plagiarism, but is sort of similar and related, and that's duplication of their old results and their old data. So sometimes an author will take something that's already published, a data set that's already published, and maybe add a little bit of new data to it and present the whole thing as completely new data. So that's a no-no, because then you're putting two things in the medical literature, two pieces of evidence, as if they're two independent pieces of evidence, and they're not. Of course, you're also just padding the medical literature with extra material that's, a paper that's not necessary. So you don't want to do that. You also don't want to submit the same data set or overlapping data sets to multiple journals at once. Journal editors often will catch that, and sometimes the reviewer for one journal is the same reviewer as for the other journal in these kinds of topics, which there's certain experts in the field. So that can get caught, and again, there's no reason that there should be multiple publications. That should all be in a single publication. So you want to also avoid self-plagiarism in this kind of duplication, and journals are becoming more savvy to all of this. It's becoming easier to detect these kinds of things now in the digital age. So a number of journals are using software that's been specifically developed to detect both plagiarism and self-plagiarism and duplication. It's very easy if you're looking for this kind of thing. If you're on the lookout for it, it's fairly easy to detect plagiarism. And the way the software works is it's looking for a lot of similarity between the newly submitted paper and other papers that are already out there in their database. And now journals are using this type of software to screen papers. Authors are now trying to go back and systematically say, well, how much plagiarism is there in the literature? Even if you don't have access to sophisticated software like that, in fact, it's actually fairly easy to catch plagiarism simply by using Google or another search engine. So when I've had a few instances where I've been trying to sleuth out some plagiarism, and the way to do it is you take a sentence from the material that you think is plagiarized, you put it in quotes and put that in Google, and if Google returns to you that same sentence in another paper, it's almost certainly plagiarized, because by the time you get a string of 7 to 10 words, it's very unlikely that two people independently will come up. Statistically, it's very unlikely that the two people will come up with the exact same string of 7 or 10 words. By the time you get to a string of 7 or 10 words, the chance that somebody else is going to put those together in the exact same configuration is actually very low. So you can pretty easily detect plagiarism just using Google, and I've done it a few times. I had a case where somebody asked me to edit a review article. Now, she hadn't written the review article. She had solicited it. She had commissioned it. But it needed some work on the prose, so I went to work on editing it. And I got through about 3 pages. I sort of got a sense of the author's style. I got to the 4th page, and the style kind of changed abruptly, and it was kind of confusing. It was all of a sudden this new material, so I was confused. And the author had cited a source. So I said, I'll go to the source and see if I can sort out what this person is talking about. So I went to the source, and it was a clearly cited source, and pulled up the source and realized that almost a page of material had been just lifted verbatim from that source and dropped into this review article. So I was a bit confused. I thought, well, maybe they had intended to kind of set it off and put quotation marks around it, but they hadn't. So was this, just an oversight? But it seemed to be a case of plagiarism. So then I got curious, and I started going through the rest of the paper, sort of doing some sleuthing here. So I took some sentences from the rest of the paper, would put them in Google, and sure enough, I popped up all sorts of plagiarism going on in this paper. So I pop in one sentence, it pulls up one paper. So they basically had taken a sentence from one paper, 2 sentences from another paper, a couple sentences from another paper. So they had really gone through the literature and just kind of stole sentences here and there and put them all together into this completely plagiarized article. So I had to go back to the person, and luckily, again, she hadn't written it, and just say, well, this is a plagiarized paper. So it does occur, and if you're looking for it, it's actually fairly easy to detect. People have actually tried to go through the literature and figure out exactly how prevalent is plagiarism in the scientific literature. It's not that easy of a question to answer, because this software that will detect plagiarism, it does a fairly good job, but then you need to go in a lot of times and check manually to really verify cases. So it takes some work. And there was an editorial in Nature where they talked about some publishers had used a particular plagiarism detection software, done some pilot studies, and they found in submitted manuscripts about 6 to 23% of the papers had some kind of plagiarism or self-plagiarism in them, that they had to then go out and immediately reject those papers. So 6 to 23% is not low. I mean, it's not huge, but it's a fairly high percentage. It's kind of a surprisingly high percentage, I think. Another study that just was published recently, a 2-year study of plagiarism in the Croatian Medical Journal. They used some automatic detection software, and then they manually confirmed these. So these were in papers submitted to the journal. 8% of the papers had plagiarized other people's work, and about 3% were self-plagiarized. So again, we're ranging around 10% of the papers having significant plagiarism in there. So this is rampant enough that journal editors are quite worried about it. It doesn't just apply to the scientific literature. Of course, there's a larger dialogue going on about plagiarism in academics, because, of course, now with everything being online, it's fairly easy to cut and paste. So another group of researchers did a study of plagiarism in the personal statements for residency applications. So these are doctors who are applying to do their residency, and they were applying to do residency at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is a very prestigious institution. So the researchers on this paper used plagiarism detection software to go through about 5,000 personal statements from these applications, and then they confirmed the suspected plagiarism manually. So about 5% of essays had pretty clear evidence of plagiarism in it. So about 1 in 20 of the doctors applying for this prestigious residency had plagiarism. So it is a significant problem. I'm just going to give you an example of another example of plagiarism that I happened to come across, just to show you that this does happen in the literature. This is a pretty blatant case of plagiarism, but it made it into the medical literature in the plagiarized paper, made it in 2002. How I happened upon this paper, I was doing a paper of my own on the use of oral contraceptives of estrogen to treat young women with bone loss due to eating disorders. And so I was reading sort of all of the papers on this subject, and especially all of the randomized trials on this subject, and there weren't so many, so I had all the papers out on this subject. And I was reading this paper, this 1995 paper, and they had found a negative result. That is, that the estrogen, the oral contraceptives, did not help the bones of women with anorexia nervosa. So they, in their discussion, were talking about multiple potential explanations of why the estrogens were not effective. And so they listed them with numbers. They said one possibility is this, the second possibility is this, a third possibility is this, a fourth and likely explanation is this. And somehow that kind of stuck in my head. So days later, I was reading through some other papers, and I kind of got a sense of deja vu. I was reading through the discussion section of another paper, and they had this numbered explanations. One possibility is, the second is, the third is. And so it struck me as very familiar. And I'm like, I think I read this already. So I went back and kind of dug out the original paper, the 1995 paper, and put the two papers side by side. And sure enough, it was some pretty blatant plagiarism. So this is the original paper, the passage that appeared in the original paper. Here's what the plagiarized paper changed. So this was a 2002 paper in a different journal, and they basically took the original passage, the original paragraph that was in the 1995 paper, and they made just the following changes that I'm showing you on the screen. That's all they changed. So they say one possibility is that the dose of estrogen effective in treating postmenopausal women, that was the original. They changed it to that the estrogen dose, which is, they added a which is. They changed a can to a may. They changed a duration of time longer to a longer period of time. The funny thing is they crossed out the third explanation, and they, only made 3 explanations. So they changed the fourth to a third and more likely. So they thought, well, we'll get rid of one of the explanations. And, again, certainly this is a clear case of plagiarism, and that's not sufficient in any way that they haven't put it in their own words at all. It's all the original author's ideas. Now, to be fair, this 2002 paper was coming from a foreign language, from a foreign country, and so it's very likely, and my guess is, that the authors weren't confident in their writing of English, and so they took that original paper and just said, well, since both studies were both similar, they were randomized trials of women with anorexia nervosa, they were extremely similar in design. So I think they just said, well, we'll kind of use that as a template, that original paper as a template, and just kind of write over it and add our own data. Of course, that's not fine, and that doesn't excuse it, but I'm guessing that that's probably the origin of it. Anyway, so quite a blatant case, and these cases do happen, and they make it in the literature. Hopefully, with better detection software, we'll see less of this in the future. Just a couple more examples. So after I went and I saw that those 2 paragraphs almost matched exactly, then of course I got really curious, and I read, compared the 2 papers side by side. And pretty much the 2002 paper was a complete copy. I mean, almost everything was copied from the 1995 paper. So here's a few more examples. This was the concluding sentence. In the first paper they say, our data demonstrate that despite its usefulness in perimenopausal women, estrogen and progestin administration does not reverse the profound osteopenia seen in all young women with anorexia nervosa. Trabecular bone loss is severe and may progress despite estrogen therapy. So the plagiarized passage just changes, again, just a few little things. In conclusion, our data demonstrate that despite its usefulness in perimenopausal women, estrogen and progestin administration does not reverse the profound osteopenia. It's almost identical. They did change anorexia nervosa to AN. They dropped in an acronym there, but pretty much it's exactly the same. So I'll give you one more example of this. I'll leave this to for those of you who are curious to compare the 2 on your own, but you can see that it's a pretty clear case of straight plagiarism. So these things do happen. They do get caught. I want to give one last example, which is a little bit more subtle. And to be fair, I think probably was unintentional, or the authors didn't really think of it as plagiarism. and I don't think that they plagiarized anything else in their paper. But I was reading a paper, a 2009 paper, and I came across this sentence: recent registry-based and hospital-based studies have documented a statistically significant increased risk of melanoma after breast cancer with standardized incidence ratios ranging from 1.4 to 2.7. And so that was the original, that was the paper that I was reading. This is the plagiarized paper. And I actually wanted to know more about those numbers, the 1.4 to 2.7. I wanted to know exactly where those came from. I wanted to dig back to the primary literature. So I started to look at the references of the 2009 paper, and their fifth reference, which isn't in this sentence, actually is not referenced here, but is referenced in the next sentence. Their fifth reference, when I got to it, I saw the exact same sentence. So the original paper, the 2004 paper, said, although earlier registry-based analyses of second neoplasms after breast cancer did not detect an increased risk, there's a little bit kind of an introductory clause here, but then we get the exact same sentence. Several recent registry-based and hospital-based studies have documented a statistically significant increased risk of melanoma after breast cancer with standardized incidence ratios ranging from 1.4 to 2.7. So it's an exact copy, and you know. And also the references 1, 2, 3, and 4 are also an exact copy. Interestingly, they didn't copy reference number 5 for whatever reason. But you might think I'm being a little nitpicky here. Well, okay, so they copied a sentence, you know, and again, I didn't find any evidence of plagiarism in the rest of the paper, and of course I got curious and I did look for that. But this is still plagiarism, and it's problematic, not only because it's a copy. You know, again, maybe the authors just lifted it and they intended to change it and they forgot, or but what's more sort of insidious and problematic here is that I can pretty much guess that the authors of the second paper didn't bother to go back to references 1, 2, 3, or 4. They just trusted that the authors of the 2004 paper had got this completely right and had summarized those numbers, 1.4 to 2.7, completely right. And as I've mentioned before, that's not a good assumption to make. You're trusting that those other authors got it perfect and that they've summarized those 4 references, and you need to really go back to those 4 references and make your own conclusions on them, because otherwise that leads to all the kinds of problems that I talked about with references being cited and poorly propagated through the literature. So again, I want to emphasize, you know, go back to your own research, or own original primary literature, the primary article. Do the research, synthesize everything on your own, write it de novo on your own. Don't just simply lift even ideas from other people, or you know, other people's synthesis of things. Don't trust that they've necessarily got it right. And of course, certainly you don't want to lift the exact language as well.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.